We're reviewing through Kings and Chronicles, but we're not going to take to go through each of these sections in Kings and Chronicles because they're rather large sections. What we're going to do is go through a basic outline of the books as we've done each week in review, and then we're going to talk about each of the time frames in the kingdoms. There's the time frame of Solomon, the United Kingdom. Then we'll talk about the northern kingdom of Israel and their kings, and then we'll come to the kings of Judah, and then we'll talk about lessons we've learned from the review from all of these books. The outline of Kings, we've outlined it this way. 1 through 11 of 1 Kings is the reign of Solomon. 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17 is the divided kingdom, and then 2 Kings 18 through 25 is after the fall of Israel and leading in the last days of Judah. 2 Chronicles divides into two sections. 1 to 9 is the reign of Solomon. 10 to 36 is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom, and also during the days in which Judah is alone. But as we go through and we look at this, if you know the periods of Bible history, there are three periods that are covered in these books. There's the end of the United Kingdom with the reign of Solomon. There's the days of the divided kingdom, and then there's the days of Judah alone. So let's talk for just a second about the end of the United Kingdom from 1 Kings. We're going to focus on Kings' account when we talk about some key chapters. As Kings is the book we're more familiar with, and Kings deals with both the northern and the southern kingdom. But in the days of the United Kingdom, which is 1 to 11, or the end of the United Kingdom, the reign of Solomon, which is 1 to 11, or is chapters 1 through 11 of 1 Kings. Now really, David reigns until 2 and in verse 12. The first chapter, and in the first 12 verses of chapter 2, is the very last days of David's reign. It's very short mentioning. It's just his instructions to Solomon in his last days. Here are some things Solomon needed to do. Here's some advice he's giving to Solomon. So we didn't outline it that way when we outlined the books because it's a really short section. But the first chapter and the first 12 verses of the second chapter are the reign of David. Beginning at verse 13 of chapter 2 and going through verse 11 deals specifically with the reign of Solomon. Now, Solomon has less recorded than the other kings of the United Kingdom, though he reigned just as long. Remember, there are three kings in the United Kingdom. All three kings reigned for how long? 40 years. The United Kingdom was 120 years total, 40 years of Saul, 40 of David, and Solomon reigned for 40. But most of what is recorded in Kings and Chronicles, the first 11 of 1 Kings and the first 9 of 2 Chronicles, when talking about Solomon, has to deal with what? Most of it is focused on him building the temple. Most of that, of his reign, is really summed up, and it was like 7 years he's building the temple. That's all dealt with mostly in that, in his reign from like chapter 4 through chapter 9. Now, I want to talk about some key chapters in each of these kingdoms. In the United Kingdom, in the days of the northern kingdom and of the southern kingdom, some key chapters we need to remember about the United Kingdom in these first 11. One of those is chapter 3. Chapter 3 is probably the most familiar story to us in the life of Solomon. And that is in 1 Kings chapter 3, this is where Solomon asked God for wisdom. Remember, God comes to Solomon and asks him what he would request of him. You know, what would you like for me to give to you? And he asked for wisdom. And because he asked for wisdom, God also gave him longevity of life as long as he would serve him. He gave him peace from his enemies, and he gave him wealth. The latter half of chapter 3 is Solomon's wisdom exemplified in the story of the two women that come to him concerning the child, one that was alive and one that was dead. And so that's why that chapter is probably the most familiar chapter to us in the life of Solomon, because those two stories, him asking God for wisdom and that wisdom exemplified. The other key chapter we want to remember is chapter 11, because chapter 11 is where Solomon turns from serving God. And if you remember in 1 Kings chapter 11, that in 1 Kings chapter 11, after it talks about Solomon's heart turning away, that as time went on, he does what's evil and he doesn't fully follow the Lord. And so the Lord became angry with him. And then eventually, because of some of his actions, the Lord says the kingdom's going to be taken away, and 10 tribes are going to be given to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So oftentimes, and we'll talk about Rehoboam when we get to the southern kingdom, oftentimes we're very critical of Rehoboam for the kingdom dividing and his poor judgment. And it was poor judgment. But God had already foretold that it would happen after the sins of Solomon. That's the chapter we're very familiar with, is chapter 11. That's where Solomon turns from God. And he's pursuing the gods of his wives. Now, let's review Israel itself, the northern kingdom. After the kingdom divides, then we have the two kingdoms. The northern we refer to as Israel, and the southern we refer to as Judah. Now, here's some important dates and some important chapters. 1 Kings chapter 12, that's taking place in about 930 BC. That is when the kingdom divides in the days of Rehoboam, and where the 10 northern tribes go with Jeroboam. So that takes place in about 930 and takes place in 1 Kings chapter 12. So if you want to mark that down, important chapters in the history of Israel. 1 Kings chapter 12 is an important chapter. That is the chapter in which the kingdom divides. 1 Kings chapter 12, the end of that, 25 to 33, this is where Jeroboam introduces idol worship in Israel, where he puts the golden calves at Dan and Bethel. That's a significant chapter because as you go throughout the history of Israel, it is said of a lot of the kings, they walked in what? The ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, or the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel to sin. What are they still doing? Worshipping idols. The idols that were put at Dan and Bethel. And so chapter 12, 25 through 33 is significant because that's where idol worship is introduced. 1 Kings 16, 29 to 34. We're introduced to King Ahab. And Ahab takes a wife by the name of Jezebel. And the point is made in 1 Kings chapter 16 that is, if though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took as a wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. And Baal worship became a problem in Israel. Now, that's eventually taken away by what king? What king destroys the temple of Baal? Jehu destroys the temple of Baal after he destroys the family of Ahab. Now, 2 Kings 17 is another important chapter. 2 Kings 17 is the fall of Israel. This takes place in 722 BC. So this is when Israel is defeated and taken away by Assyria in 2 Kings 17. So that, again, another important chapter, an important date, 722 BC is when that takes place. Now, let's talk about some of the kings of Israel themselves for just a minute. Let's go through the list of the kings, and we're going to list just some things about them. Some we'll spend more time on than others. Some of them we'll pass through rather quickly. But let's talk about some of these kings of Israel. The first of which is Jeroboam, which we already mentioned, the son of Nebat. Jeroboam is the one, again, we mentioned this earlier, who set up the calves at Dan and Bethel. Now here's something important we need to remember about Jeroboam. When Jeroboam introduced the idol worship at Dan and Bethel, that he changed 4 things about the way that Israel was worshiping. 4 things he changed about their worship. This is important to remember. He changed the place at which they worshiped. Where were they to go worship God? To Jerusalem. So they're going to go to Jerusalem to worship. But Jeroboam feared that if they went back to Jerusalem, which Jerusalem's in which kingdom? It's in Judah. If they go back to Jerusalem, their heart would go to who? Rehoboam. And so if they go to Jerusalem to worship, their heart may go to Rehoboam, and then his thought was, well, they'll turn from being with me, so I'm going to fix that by putting these calves at Dan and Bethel. And if you're in the northern part of Israel, well, guess what? Don't have to go too far. There's one there at Dan. And if you're in the southern part of Israel, guess what? You don't have to go very far. There's one at Bethel. And if you're in the middle, you can equally go as far. But nobody has to make that long trek to Jerusalem. By the way, how would that have sounded to the people? It would have sounded good. It would have sounded appealing. Who wants to go all the way down to Jerusalem when you live near Dan? Take a several days journey down to Jerusalem, or walk there, take a horse there, a donkey there, be there in 4 or 5 hours to get over to Dan. No problem. It makes it a whole lot easier trip. Now, not only does he change the place, he changes the time in which they were to worship. God has given them specifics as to when these feasts are to be held, but when you go through the reign of Jeroboam, he changes the time in which they are worshiping God. When you come down to the latter half, it says that of chapter 12, it says that Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim and dwelt there. Also, he went out from went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David, if these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of this people would turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Jeroboam, king of Judah. So then he makes the 2 golden calves and said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people, went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel. So here he decides that he's going to change when these feasts are held. And God's given instructions on when the feasts are to be held, and the Passover and all these feasts, they're to celebrate and go back to Jerusalem. And Jeroboam decides, I'm going to make my own feast, and we're going to tell them, you can serve here, and you can do it on the 15th day of the 8th month. So he's changed the place, he's changed the time, he changed the people. You notice in what we read that he made priests from what? From anywhere. Listen, no matter where you're from, do you want to be a priest? Go right ahead, you can be a priest. Versus God said they need to be priests from where? Levi. Jeroboam changed the people. Jeroboam changed the object. Who were they to worship? What were they worshiping instead? The calves at Dan and Bethel. So he changed the place from Jerusalem to Dan and Bethel. He changed the time from the time prescribed to the Passover to the 8th month and the 15th day. He changed the people from the people of Levi to anybody they wanted to be. And he changed the object from God to golden calves. So remember that about Jeroboam. He changed the place, the time, the people, and the object of worship by putting in the golden calves. Now after him we have Nadab who reigns, and Nadab is killed by Baasha. Again, some of these we won't spend very long on. Nadab reigns after Jeroboam, and he's killed by Baasha, who takes the throne, and Baasha is simply described as somebody that is extremely wicked. Remember this when we go through Israel. Something we're very well familiar with. But in the nation of Israel, there were how many good kings? None. Some were worse than others, but there was no good king in Israel. But Baasha is described as extremely wicked, and eventually he is followed by Elah, and Elah is the one that is killed by Zimri while drinking himself drunk. Now, Zimri, the 5th king, we don't know a whole lot about, because how long does Zimri reign? 7 days. He rules for just 1 week. And then what happens? Zimri is being pursued by Omri. And as he's being pursued by Omri, and Omri is coming in and closing in, Zimri knows he's not going to be king very long. He knows Omri and those that are with him will overtake him. Omri is more favorable among the people than Zimri. So Zimri decides to burn the palace down around himself. And so Zimri then is followed by Omri. Now, a couple of things about Omri. Prior to Omri, but let me back up. Where do we often associate the capital of Israel, that northern kingdom, being? Samaria. Oftentimes it will be referred to as, sometimes the nation as a whole will just simply be referred to by the prophets as Samaria. That's where the capital is. Prior to Omri taking the throne, the capital was in Tirzah. But Omri is the one that moves it from Tirzah to Samaria. But there's something else about Omri that we should be familiar with. He's the beginning of what line? Ahab's family. When Omri comes to the throne, it is said that Omri was more wicked than all the kings that were before him. Then his son comes to the throne, Ahab. What's said about Ahab? He's more wicked than all that are before him. And guess what? That's never said again about the kings of Israel. So Omri is the beginning of that wicked line of Ahab. Now, that will help us in appreciating this statement. We saw it a minute ago. In 1 Kings chapter 16, when Ahab comes to the throne, the point is made that as though it would have been a trivial thing to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that Ahab took as a wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, and that he worshipped Baal, or went up to worship Baal. Now, you think about how wicked Omri is. And then Ahab comes to the throne, and you think about what he's learned from his father, Omri. And then Ahab goes out, and he marries somebody as wicked as Jezebel. That helps us appreciate that statement, as though it would have been a trivial thing. As if walking in the sins of Jeroboam wouldn't have been bad enough. As if being anything like his father wouldn't have been bad enough. He then marries Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and thus he made Baal worship the official religion of Israel. Ahab, we're familiar with oftentimes facing off with what prophet? Elijah. Ahab is the one that is reigning when Elijah says there's going to be the drought. Ahab is the one that is still reigning 3.5 years later when Ahab faces off with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. Even down the road, Ahab is the one that is still reigning when Elijah comes back. He comes back and appoints Elisha as his replacement and goes through and appoints others. Ahab's still the king. Now, here is where the lines between the two kingdoms eventually get crossed. Ahab's daughter marries the son of who? What king of Judah? Jehoshaphat. And we'll talk about Jehoshaphat in a minute. He's a good king that made some poor choices. But this is where the lines are eventually going to get crossed between the two. And so for a time, you're going to have some that are family lines connected between the two kingdoms. Now, Ahab is followed by his son Ahaziah. Ahaziah is described as an evil king. Now, he's not as bad as his father, but he's still an evil king. Ahaziah is the one that falls through the lattice of his upper room and sends messengers to inquire of God as to what's going to happen to him. And they come and they meet Elijah, and Elijah tells them, let him know that what? He's going to die. And they come back and they tell him that somebody stopped us and told us. And they don't know who, the messengers Ahaziah sends don't know who this messenger was or who it was that told them this. But somebody stopped and told us that the Lord says you're not going to live. Ahaziah asks him who it is, and they describe him, and he says, that's Elijah. He was very well familiar with Elijah. Ahaziah doesn't reign very long, though, as he fell through the lattice work. Ahaziah did not have any sons that would sit on the throne. Instead, he's replaced by who? His brother. Jehoram comes to the throne, and again, this is Ahaziah's brother. How does Jehoram die? Jehoram is the son of Ahab that is shot and killed by Jehu. Remember this, when Jehu is told he is going to be king, in 2 Kings, he's told he's going to be king, the Lord told him he needed to do what to the family of Ahab? Destroy them. Destroy the family of Ahab. And so, Jehu does that. He kills Jehoram of Israel, as well as, and we'll see this later on, Ahaziah of Judah, who would have been the grandson of Ahab. Different Ahaziah than the king that reigned before Jehoram. But Jehoram's nephew, who also was named Ahaziah, was also killed. Both of those are killed by Jehu, as Jehu is carrying out the commandment of God to destroy the family of Ahab. So that's how Jehoram dies. Well, who succeeds Jehoram then? Jehu. Jehu is the one that destroys Baal worship. I told him to take care of the family of Ahab, and Jehu's the one that eventually destroys Baal worship. Remember, he conceived this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to tell the people that they need to come together and gather to worship Baal. This is found in 2 Kings chapter 10, beginning at verse 18. And Jehu gathers them all together. And he tells the people there, we need to make sure that there's none of the worshipers of the Lord among us. The people of Baal think Jehu's wanting to offer God worship, or wanting to offer Baal worship, and make sure nobody's there that's just that's not really going to serve Baal. But instead, what's Jehu trying to do? Destroy the prophets of Baal, destroy the worshipers of Baal, and save those who serve God. And so Jehu contrives this plan. He's got people outside, and he tells them, we're going to go in and we're going to kill them. And if anybody escapes, what are you supposed to do to the men outside? Kill them, and if they get by you, you're going to pay with your life. And so he destroys Baal worship. And because of what he does, he has promised that he would have 4 generations to sit on the throne of Israel. So 4 generations are going to sit on the throne after Jehu. Now, we talk about Jehu and the fact there's no good kings in all Israel. Jehu was as close as they came to a good king in Israel. Here God says, this is what I want you to do, and Jehu does it. He made sure it was followed out. He makes the point that in chapter 10 that he's going to do exactly what the Lord said needed to be done. But Jehu didn't get rid of what? The golden calves at Dan and Bethel. And so he gets rid of the sin of Baal worship, but he follows in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Now, Jehu's going to be followed by Jehoahaz, and the Lord delivers Jehoahaz from the hands of Syria, and he pleads with God, and he pleads with God for that deliverance, and God gave it to him. That's the first of the descendants to sit on the throne for Jehu. Jehoash comes to the throne. Jehoash is on the throne. He goes and he visits Elisha when Elisha is on his deathbed. And Elisha tells him to shoot out the window and strike the ground with the arrow. Jehoash strikes the ground 3 times, indicating that he would strike Syria 3 and only 3 times. And this is recorded for us in 2 Kings chapter 13. Beginning at verse 10 is the reign of Jehoash, and it goes on through the end of the chapter. Now, Jehoash is followed by Jeroboam the second. Now, we noted this before when covering him. Jeroboam the second is not actually named Jeroboam the second. His name is just Jeroboam. But for the sake of having 2, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, we refer to him as Jeroboam the second to make it easier to distinguish. Israel regained most of its border that it had originally had during the reign of Jeroboam II. Their borders were as far and wide as they had been at any time of the divided kingdom during the days of Jeroboam II. And we date the prophet of Jonah from his reign because it mentions in Jonah that it's during the reign. Or when you read through Kings and you read through Jonah, you can put the 2 time frames together, that it's during the reign of Jeroboam II. Now Zechariah comes to the throne. He is the last of 4 generations of Jehu to sit on the throne. Just an interesting side note, nothing important here. He's the only one not to have a name with a J. That makes it, but he comes to the throne, and he reigns for only 6 months before he is killed by Shallum, which then brings Shallum to the throne. Shallum reigned 1 month, and he's killed by Menahem. Menahem is the one who rips open the women with children. Then Menahem is followed by Pekahiah. Pekahiah is killed by Pekah. Pekah had been a captain in Pekahiah's army that rebelled against him and killed him. And then Pekah is killed by Hoshea. Hoshea comes to the throne, and he's the last king of Israel. And then it's during his reign that Samaria falls in 722 BC. Now, we've gone through those latter ones rather quickly, so we can get over to the kings of Israel here in just a second. But I want to note something about Israel and Judah. We see that there are 19 kings to reign in Israel. Do you know how many reign in Judah? 20. 20 reign in Judah. Do you know how much longer Judah lasts than Israel? Keep in mind, both kingdoms begin in 930. They both begin at the same time when the kingdom divides. So, keep that in mind. We'll get to the answer here in just 1 second. So 19 reign here. Now, let's go to a review of Judah. Kingdom divides in 930, and the first captivity is 605 or 606 BC. That's the captivity recorded in 2 Kings 24, 8 through 16. That's the first captivity that takes place. The third and final, there are 3 total captivities. The third and final is the destruction of Jerusalem, and that takes place in 586. That's recorded in 2 Kings 25, which we saw last week. Now, think about this. Israel is destroyed in 722. Then Judah is completely destroyed, and everybody taken away in 586. Now, 605 and 606 is before the kings are really more figureheads, because that's the last time they're more independent. But until 586, that's when we have the last king reigning in Jerusalem. Now, I want you to think about that. And the fact that there's well over 100 years, about 140 years that passes from the end of Israel to the end of Judah. How do we have so much more time that takes place in those 2 kingdoms? There's only one more king. What happened repeatedly when we reviewed the kings of Israel? Yes, there would be several that would eventually come in, and they would decide to take over, and they would just get rid of the king before them. Remember this, in Israel, there is no continuing line. There are some dynasties that reign. Jehus, Omris. There are some dynasties there. But for the most part, Israel is constantly changing dynasties, and you've got, this man wants to be king, so he kills this man that is king, and now he reigns, but then somebody doesn't like him, and so 6 months later, somebody else comes along and kills him and takes over the throne. That just shows us Israel and all their wickedness, what kind of nation it was, that they were constantly fighting and killing one another in order to seize the power. It's a very wicked nation. Now, Judah lasts until 586. Judah does have good kings. Judah also has their share of wicked kings. The first king of Judah is Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. It is during his days that the kingdom divides. And this is a king that is evil. And then you've got a stretch where he's good. And then at the end of his life, he's evil again. Sometimes you see some good kings that become evil. In the case of Manasseh, it's a rarity. We see an evil king that eventually turns and repents. But in the case of Rehoboam, we saw a bad king who became a good king, who turned back to being a bad king. And Rehoboam fought against Shishak from Egypt. Now, Rehoboam was followed by his son Abijam, and Abijam was a very bad king. Abijam was followed by Asa. Asa is the first of the good kings. Now, again, Rehoboam was bad then good then bad. But of your first kings that were more consistently good, Asa was the first good king. But Asa made a mistake later in his life. Later in his life, Asa became lifted up with pride. He sought the help of those around him rather than inquiring of God. and becomes lifted up with pride, and eventually the Lord causes him to be diseased in his feet. And after Asa is diseased in his feet, he seeks out who rather than God? He seeks the help of the physicians rather than of turning to God and asking for help. So the Lord has punished him for his pride, and then he doesn't even turn back to serve God, but continues to turn towards the physicians and towards man rather than towards God. Now Asa's son follows him, and his son is Jehoshaphat. And again, Jehoshaphat is a good king. There are a lot of good things that can be said about Jehoshaphat. Kings does not record a lot on Jehoshaphat. Second Chronicles records a lot more of his reign. And again, Second Chronicles is more detailed on the reigns of the kings of Judah, because Second Chronicles is following only the line of Judah. If you note, when you come to the end of the life of several of the kings in Israel or in Judah, it makes the point that they rested with their fathers. And for example, at the end of Abijam, so he rested with his father, or the rest of the acts of Abijam in 1 Kings 15:7. And all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? When you turn over to Chronicles, you've got a recording of the kings of Judah. And it's in more detail there. So Jehoshaphat's reign is covered in chapter 17, chapter 18, and through chapter 19 and 20. He reigns for quite a while, and all those chapters cover the reign of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat made one big mistake. And what was that? He formed an alliance. He does form an alliance with Moab and Israel. He forms an alliance with Ahab, and eventually gives his son to marry Ahab's daughter. Ahab's daughter, by the way, her name was Athaliah. And these passages in Proverbs 8 and Psalm 119 just talk about the importance of those who are around. But he forms an alliance with Ahab. He goes to war with Ahab. They seal their alliance by the marriage of their children. That's a big mistake Jehoshaphat makes. Jehoshaphat, by the way, the Lord rebukes him for that, and yet he continues to ally himself with others later on. And that's recorded in Chronicles as well. Jehoshaphat had a son by the name of Jehoram. Remember, there's a Jehoram and an Ahaziah in both kingdoms. Now, this Jehoram is the son of Jehoshaphat. He's married to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab. And Jehoram killed all of his brothers. In order to ensure that he kept the throne, he kills all of his brothers. He dies from an intestinal disease. It says in 2 Chronicles 22, verse 1, that all his children were taken away, or his sons were taken away by raiders, with the exception of one, and we'll get to that son in a moment. But a sad statement is made about the life of Jehoram. One of the saddest statements, I think, in all the Scriptures, and that statement is recorded in 2 Chronicles 21 and in verse 20, in which it simply says this, in 2 Chronicles 21 and in verse 20. He was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 8 years, and to no one's sorrow he departed. However, they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. When Jehoram died, there was nobody that was sorrowful to see him die. What a sad statement about Jehoram. That tells us something about Jehoram as well. Here's a man that dies, that nobody is sorry he's gone. In fact, when they bury Jehoram, they do not give him the honor of being buried with the kings. They do bury him in Jerusalem, but not, according to verse 20 of 2 Chronicles 21, in the tomb of the kings. Now, Jehoram's only son living is Ahaziah, and he comes to the throne. Again, this is the only son of Jehoram left, and he dies from the wounds inflicted by Jehu. Remember again, Jehoram and Ahaziah of Israel, Ahab's sons, they are Ahaziah of Judah's uncles, because their sister is Athaliah. Ahaziah's mother. And so when they're destroying the family of Ahab, Ahaziah is Ahab's grandson. He goes to see his uncle, Jehoram of Israel. And it is then that both Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah are struck by Jehu and killed, and he dies in 841 BC. Now, he's followed not by a king, but by the only one of the queens in either of the kingdoms. And that is Athaliah. To say Athaliah is wicked would be an understatement. This woman killed all her grandsons except for Joash in order to ensure that she kept the throne. And the only reason that Joash is not killed is why? He's hidden. So she reigns for 7 years, or for 6 years, and then Joash comes to the throne. Joash is but a year old, and he's hidden by Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat from his grandmother. He comes to the throne at 7 years old, and he repairs the temple. And Joash comes out. When you look at Joash, he has such a promising start in his reign. But there was a problem, and that was Joash relied too much on who? Too much on Jehoiada the priest. After Jehoiada's death, he becomes wicked. And in fact, it says of him that all the days, he does what was right in the sight of the Lord, all the days, Jehoiada the priest. Eventually, Joash is rebuked by Zechariah the prophet. Not Zechariah the prophet that wrote the book Zechariah. This is a different prophet named Zechariah. And he is not satisfied with Zechariah, so what does he have done? He has Zechariah put to death. Zechariah, by the way, is whose son? Jehoiada the priest's son. They would have grown up alongside each other. He would have seen Zechariah. He grew up in the household of Zechariah's parents, and eventually, what does he do? But kill Zechariah. By the way, that's a note when you get to the New Testament, and Jesus talks about the blood all the way from Abel unto Zechariah. In the Hebrew Bible, the last of the books are the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. And so the last recorded martyr in the Old Testament would be Zechariah. That's why Jesus mentions that. His death here, being put to death for doing what was right at the hands of Joash. Now Joash is followed by Amaziah, and Amaziah starts right and defeats the Edomites, and then after he defeats the Edomites, he begins to worship their gods. Now, he's followed by Uzziah. Uzziah is a good king at the start, but Uzziah eventually offers a sacrifice that he shouldn't have. He offers incense that he shouldn't have, goes into the temple and offers this incense, and the Lord strikes him with leprosy. Now, when you get into the book of Isaiah, we can date the days of Isaiah based on the fact that Uzziah was king at the beginning of the days of the prophesying of Isaiah the priest. Uzziah is followed by Jotham. Jotham is a good king, but he doesn't go into the temple. He offers worship elsewhere. He is followed by Ahaz. Ahaz is a very wicked king, and in in Isaiah chapter 7, which Isaiah chapter 7 is a chapter we very well know for what prophecy? You know what prophecy we're most familiar with Isaiah 7 for? Isaiah 7 and verse 14 talks about the virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son. But it's in the midst of a conversation where Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz. That's the conversation taking place when this is made. It's what the Lord is having Isaiah say to King Ahaz. Ahaz is followed by his son Hezekiah. Hezekiah is as good a king as his father was as bad a king. He's a very good king. He does pay tribute to Sennacherib when he's pursued, or when they're there. He's the one that asked Isaiah to pray for Israel. He is the one that Sennacherib has surrounded, but when Sennacherib is defeated by an angel of the Lord. And he's also the king that has his life extended by 15 years. Remember with Hezekiah, this is just a historical standpoint. Sennacherib's recording of his conquerings and of his campaigns, there's a statement that says, I have Hezekiah shut up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And then that's the last you hear of it because they didn't record the defeat at the hands of the angel of the Lord that night. Hezekiah is followed by Manasseh. Manasseh is an evil king that later repents. He's one that shed much innocent blood. Josephus, in writing of the history, said he did not even spare the prophets of Manasseh, or talking of Manasseh. In fact, when Judah is punished, it's attributed to the sins of whom? Manasseh. Manasseh is followed by Ammon. Ammon is a wicked king, just like his father Manasseh, but unlike his father, he does not repent or humble himself. Excuse me. So again, a wicked king like his father who does not repent. He's followed by Josiah. Josiah comes to the throne at a very young age, at the measly age of 8 years old. I don't know about you, but if I had to choose a ruler, an 8-year-old would probably not be at the top of my list. But Josiah was a very good king. He is the last of the good kings. In fact, Josiah is probably the second best king in all the history of the southern kingdom, except for Hezekiah. Josiah is the one that repairs the temple and restores worship. He makes a covenant with God in 2 Kings 23 and in verse 3, but he dies at Megiddo at the hands of Pharaoh Necho at still a young age. Josiah is then followed by Jehoahaz, who reigned for only 3 months before being put in prison by Pharaoh Necho. He's followed by Jehoiakim, who's made king by Pharaoh Necho. Jehoiakim is followed by Jehoiachin, or Coni, he's also referred to. He's taken away during the second invasion and is prophesied against him in Jeremiah 22. And then Zedekiah comes to the throne. This is Josiah's son. He's the last king. And he's a vassal of the king of Babylon. He's more a figurehead and not much of a king. Now, got about a minute left. Let's just list some practical lessons here real quick that we've learned. And when you go through these, we learn that God keeps His promises. God prophesied that if you follow me, this is what benefit there will be for you. Here's your reward. And if you fail to do so, I'll punish you. And God did that in these kingdoms. God makes several promises throughout the 1 King and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and He keeps them. I learned we can be influenced by those around us. Solomon was, and Ahab was. And those two serve as examples to us. As though it had been a trivial thing for Ahab to be like Jeroboam, he marries Jezebel. And Solomon's heart is brought away by all his wives. I learned God punishes the wicked. He punishes the wicked kings throughout their reign here, the family of Ahab and others. But He ultimately punishes the wicked nations of Israel and Judah. I learned that God must be first in our lives. There were those that seemed like they were doing pretty good, but eventually they let other things get in their way of service to God. And I learned that good people make mistakes. I learned that in the story of Jehoshaphat, who's a good king, but he made some mistakes in aligning himself with Ahab. Now, next week we'll begin the book of Ezra. We'll study Ezra 1 and 2 along with Daniel 9, Jeremiah 25. Thank you for your attention this evening.